I think the point that we're really discovering in all of these discussions is that many out there, and your friends in churches, are not convinced that the teaching of Jesus really matters. Now, I hope that won't sound too radical. Listen to these quotes from Dr. James Kennedy of Coral Ridge Ministries, the late Dr. James Kennedy. He said this, and I quote, "Many people today think that the essence of Christianity is Jesus' teaching, but that is not so. Christianity centers not in the teachings of Jesus, but in the person of Jesus as incarnate God, who came into the world to take upon himself our guilt and die in our place." That's from his How I Know Jesus is God, Truths That Transform, November the 11th, 1989. That's an astonishingly mistaken statement. I would say to you that the teachings of Jesus are and must be the standard for Christianity. Think of the text like, "That's my beloved Son, listen to him." Listen to him. John 12:44 and onwards, several verses there, Jesus insists that his words, his teachings, are the standard by which we're going to be judged. 1 Timothy 6:3 says, if anybody comes to you and doesn't bring the teaching of Jesus, watch out. You're being deceived. You're being taken in, flat out. Let me give you another quotation from Dr. Harold O.J. Brown in his book, Heresies, a very interesting account of the history of dogma, incidentally. 1984, page 13. He says this, "While Buddhism and Islam are based primarily on the teaching of the Buddha and Muhammad, respectively, Christianity is based primarily on the person of Christ. Christianity is not belief in Jesus' teaching, but what is taught about him. The appeal to, quote, believe as Jesus believed, rather than to believe in Jesus, is a dramatic transformation of the fundamental nature of Christianity." This is extraordinarily wrong. We had better try to believe what Jesus believed, follow his teachings, and of course believe in his death and resurrection and so on. That's perfectly clear. But there's a very sinister, I would say poisonously deceptive idea being propagated here, that you can get by without the teaching of Jesus. This tends to make people think that Paul invented Christianity. And then worse, ultra-dispensationalism, which says that only the late teachings of Paul really count, or a more moderate form of dispensationalism, which says that only Paul really counts. Jesus was preaching to Jews. This is destructive beyond description. It's a quick way not to be saved, to believe that the teachings of Jesus are not for you. So I think it's perfectly clear in 2 John 7-9 that John warned. The apostolic warning is quite explicit. If somebody comes and doesn't bring the teaching of Messiah to you, you are being deceived. Don't welcome that person. Denounce him as a dangerous false prophet. This might lead then, I think, to a realization that the extent of deception, the extent of confusion is very great indeed, and that should put us all on our toes to be digging into Scripture very persistently and concentrating firstly on the teachings of Jesus, taking in the Old Testament, which he endorsed, of course, and then the teaching of Paul, noting at the same time that the Old Covenant is not the same as the New. Physical circumcision was mandated for everyone, Jew and Gentile, in Genesis 17. The exact opposite is said in Galatians, where Paul did say something very radical. He said, if you go and get physically circumcised, don't do it. He's addressing Jew and Gentile. Don't do it. If you do that, you'll be obliged to keep the whole law. Don't go there. Only today I was trying to persuade a keen questioner on the internet that wearing tassels is not doing you any good. You don't need to do that. That misadvertises the faith. You don't have to become a Jew and keep the Sabbath, holy days, and new moons in order to be valid. You don't have to abide by the food laws. Even Mark 7:19 has a nice parenthetical comment by Mark there, noting that Jesus, in fact, was abolishing the Leviticus 11 distinction. Paul in Romans 14 plainly says, I'm convinced, and he's a Jew, he's a Christian. I, Paul, the Jew and the Christian, am convinced that nothing is unclean in itself unless you think it is. Now that's not Leviticus 11. All things, he says in Romans 14:14, Romans 14:20, all things are katharat, they're clean. The very opposite of akathartos, unclean. It really doesn't get more straightforward than that. So yes, Paul is very, very radical. Jesus speaks in Paul, but behind that lies the teaching of Jesus that he gave while he was here in his historical ministry, plus Jesus in Paul, then that total package, then rounded off in Revelation with 22 chapters of Jesus himself speaking, enlightening us with about 450 quotations from the Hebrew prophets about the future that still lies ahead. And do remember the Shema, listen Israel, the Lord our God is one person, is one Lord, is one God. All the same. This was not a puzzle. Don't get arguing about which is the right translation. They all say the same thing. Perfectly obvious unitary monotheism coming from the words and the teachings of Jesus as the most important command of all.